Hey guys, Brent Old Build Show, talking today about the Industrial Revolution. Now, why would I talk about that, right? I'm talking about that because we're going to study Victorian architecture. But Victorian means Gothic Revival, Italianate, Second Empire, Queen Anne, all these different styles that are part of that Victorian era. But to understand, how we get there, we got to look at the Industrial Revolution and how the handmade goes to the machine made, and how our parts and pieces and how we build our houses completely changes today on the Build Show. Okay, so Victorian, right? Why is it called Victorian? Well, Queen Victoria is on her throne in England, so it's after that Victorian style. That's why it's Victorian. It's that era, okay? But what's happening in America is that, and all over the world really, is we're going through the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is really what changes and makes the Victorian possible. Okay, we're traveling more, we're seeing more of the world. You have these inspirations, you have an Egyptian revival, right? You have these Persian revival. You have all these kind of weird revivals that happened during the Victorian era. And it's because of travel, because the world's expanding, because of railroads, right? All those things are allowing people, 200 years ago, people never left their town, right? They never traveled. And all of a sudden, after the Grand Tour, there's touring companies where you can actually go tour to the world, right? That happens, steamships, that happens because of the Industrial Revolution. So, the Victorian style is a style we're going to get into, okay? But first, we have to understand how we got there. Now, look, if you look at this house, okay, this is a Second Empire house, right? Look at the entry hall here, okay? An explosion of wood, right? Carved wood, ornate wood, all kinds of different shapes, all kinds of different ornamentation. Notice too, this is stained grade wood, right? You don't have stained grade wood pre-industrial, okay? We'll talk about that. All the ornamentation on the outside, right? We are able to build this because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the way the building changes and the way the machinery changes the way we build. And if you think about it as far as running a molding, okay? This is a crown, okay? Crown molding plane. Now, that peg, okay, that hole, you put a peg through it and you tie ropes to it. Now, why do you think you did that? Because you hired the young apprentice, right, to put the rope around his chest and push you and carry your blade across a piece of wood, okay? Because to plane a 5-inch wide piece of pine, okay, with a molding plane like that took a lot of strength, and you weren't just going to push your hand through it, right? You needed help. Sometimes they had horses do this stuff, right? So think about when the plane mill came on, the steam plane mill came along, and that piece of knife actually spinning really fast. Not only can you plane pine very fast, but you can plane oak and walnut and cherry and all these wonderful woods. Now, this is 1899, and this is Stanley 55, okay? And basically, it's a molding plane. You see all these different cutters here where you'd actually take this plane and make your own moldings. This is the end of an era, okay? This doesn't happen and doesn't go on very well because planing mills can plane so much faster and easier. Now, let me just show you what's happening during this period. Did a little map here. I'm just going to talk about all the crazy things that are going on in this, 40, 50 year period. Let me show you what's going on in this, 50, 60 year period of time that is Victorian, and the, dynamic change that happens right here, okay? So 1840, turn off the TV. 1848, okay? I showed on Instagram last week this planing mill, right? Lawrence's molding planing mill, patented 1848. All these Greek revival and Gothic moldings. Look, 30% less than hand labor, right? They're advertising that that it's less expensive than doing it by hand. Now, the steam planing mills are happening in kind of this area of time. Right here, you have the Civil War, right? So that's into 1865. The rise of the railroad cannot be kind of emphasized enough. Now, railroads are happening back here, but really railroads, as far as going around the country, happens and just explodes in this period of time. That means more travel. That means people are moving around more, right? you have planing mills. Really, because of the Civil War, if you think about 1848, and that's where the steam planing mill was kind of started, and I've got a couple of pamphlets and catalogs from the 1840s in New York. Now, smaller cities wouldn't have a steam planing mill. Only big cities, Baltimore, and I think is one of the ones I have in New York, right? They have steam planing mills. Smaller towns wouldn't have that. So this isn't happening everywhere. But if you think that industrialization is starting here, right? It really doesn't happen until after the Civil War. And most of the millwork catalogs that I've got from that period all start 1868, 66, I think is Curtis. But the planing mills, right, the large ones that begin to make doors, windows, moldings starts kind of right here. So the industrialization of woodworking kind of happens in that period. Railroads allow things to expand much farther. So framing, think about framing. Before here, you were timber framing a house, okay? Now, timber framing, as you may know, is where you take huge logs, right, and you are joining them together like a big piece of furniture. Stick framing, I think, was invented in Chicago in the 1850s or 60s. It really takes off after this point. It's balloon framing, but this is dynamic, okay? Timber framing used to take skilled laborers who are practiced in timber framing to build a frame, know how to put it together, know how to make it last. Stick framing, right? There's no joinery. All you're doing is taking a nail and driving two boards together. A much simpler, easier, less skilled labor way of building, right? Dramatic change. Softwoods versus hardwoods. I talked about this, easier. Hardwoods. The planing mills allow you to run hardwoods. It's the reason why these Victorian houses, Victorian mansions have oak and maple and mahogany and walnut and all those luxury hardwoods which used to be exclusive for furniture are now available inside the homes of these houses. Okay? The other thing, you have the rising middle class, right? This whole thing, the rise of the cities happened at this time. People going in for factory jobs. And all of a sudden you have this rising middle class who can afford more houses. Design changes, okay? You have over here, remember we were talking about Asher Benjamin before. We were talking about his books. And those plan books, right, were very influential, okay, as far as how design happened. You had these architects giving plan books, handing it down to carpenters. After this period, with pulp paper and everything else, you have the Ladies' Home Journal, right? So a magazine, right, is journal is offering house plans in their monthly magazines, right? And so all of a sudden design's much more accessible. Doesn't mean it's good design, right? But design is more accessible. So you have all these different things going on. Standardization, right? Back here, because it's a handmade era, right? Everything's custom, right? Everything is unique to that house or unique to that builder. Over here, right? This is custom. Right over here, you have standardization, where one of my books in the 1890s, okay, basically standardized the molding catalog, okay, the universal molding catalog. And they collected all these patterns and profiles, and all the mill firms that are starting out here were selling the exact same moldings everywhere. So you get the same molding in Chicago that you get in Fort Worth, right? Standardization is taking place. You no longer have regional ideas. Do you see this? Kind of crazy, right? That all of these things are happening. Building is changing, right? Houses are going up faster. It's more accessible, right? I mean, the everyman house in 1780 is completely different from the one in 1920, right? It's just completely different. So all these changes are happening because of industrialization. And the reason why those Victorian houses look the way they do is because machines enabled them to have them, right? So the carved brackets, the huge carved brackets, realize that all the machines that we use in our shop today, molders, planers, band saws, scroll saws, duplicarvers. We don't have duplicarver, but they're available today. They were available in the 1870s. So the brackets and the carving and the other things that were happening on these houses were mechanized and were actually fairly cheap. One reason why those Victorian houses look the way they do is because they could. You know what I mean by that? They were able to, It was almost, look what we can do. Oh my gosh, we can do anything. And they did. So anyway, industrialization changes building. And you need to understand that, because when we go to look at these rooms and we start building these rooms, we're going to pick up moldings. You're like, holy moly, that's a huge piece of wood, right? They could, right? Look how big that base is. Look at the profile and the things. Yes, that's right. They could. And so you're going to see this ornamentation and this detail that changes the way we build and completely changes how a Greek revival to a Gothic revival to a Queen Anne changes. And we're going to be studying that in the coming weeks when we dig into that. So at the beginning of this video, we talked about how the Industrial Revolution changes architecture, and to study Victorian, right, to study the Victorian style with the Gothic revival and the Italianate and the Second Empire and all the different styles, we had to understand what happened, right? What happened to technology that enabled this. So let me just show you some of the things we'll be looking at and some of the things we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. This obviously is Gothic revival, right? You see the barge boards ends, and that kind of scroll work and that kind of detail is all machine made. It just wouldn't have been made by hand. This is the Italianate style. The Italianate style, you can recognize it because of the brackets under the eave, okay? So very popular styles all over the Northeast. This is Second Empire. Now, Second Empire is a reference to the French. Mansard was the French architect who kind of invented that mansard roof. And so anyway, this is kind of the French influence. Remember, we're traveling globally now. I told you there was an Egyptian revival and a Persian revival in the Victorian area. So it's no doubt that we have some French influence. It's called a stick style, right? Or a carpenter Gothic sometimes it would be called. So this is a stick style of architecture. Notice all that wood, right? Queen Anne, Queen Anne, wow. Look at all the parts and pieces and the crazy movement. The turrets, almost always on Queen Anne houses, you have a turret like this. So again, explosion of woodwork, explosion of millwork. And then lastly, we have the shingle style, right? The shingle style was obviously because there's shingles covering the whole body of the house. Very popular in the 1890s out on the coast. Beach things, Newport, McKean Mead and White were very good. In fact, this style is still very popular. Wade actually just built a shingle style house out there on in Rhode Island. So all this Victorian architecture, right? These are the things we're going to be looking at and studying in the coming weeks and months as we dig into this style of architecture. I hope it's not confusing, right? Because you have all these different styles of architecture that are called Victorian, right? And yet they're different styles, right? So what you have is the Victorian era, right? After the Industrial Revolution, you have the Victorian era. And so within that time period, you have these different stylings. Now, they have similarities, right? How they are built, the kind of ornamentation, right? So they're all Victorian architecture, but there's different types and styles. It's really the only period where you have so many different styles within an era. But this Victorian era, right, and Victorian architecture is different and unique. We'll be getting into that and studying that. I'm Brent Hull. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks for watching.